The restaurant door swung shut behind Elena Vasquez, and the cool San Diego night wrapped around her shoulders like a familiar blanket. She had spent 3 hours reviewing after-action reports with her team over steaks and too much coffee, and now the parking structure across the street beckoned with the promise of her truck and the 40-minute drive home to silence and sleep. She crossed the street without hurrying, her boots quiet on the asphalt. The parking structure rose 4 levels above her, half empty at this hour, fluorescent lights casting pale pools between shadows. Her truck waited on level 2, tucked into a corner spot near the stairwell, because old habits from deployment never quite died. Always know your exits. Always keep your back to a wall. The stairwell door clanged behind her as she climbed, her mind still cycling through the debrief details. The mission had gone clean. No casualties, objectives achieved, extraction on schedule. A good operation by any measure. Yet something in her gut whispered that the next one would not be so simple. The cartels were adapting, learning, finding new routes and new methods faster than intelligence could track them. She pushed through the door on a level 2 and spotted her truck immediately, a dark silhouette against the concrete wall. 30 feet away, 20 seconds from being on the road and done with this day. The voice came from her left, casual and slightly breathless. "Excuse me, miss. You have jumper cables? My buddy's car died, and we cannot get it started." Elena turned. 3 men stood near a sedan with its hood raised, steam curling from what appeared to be an overheated engine. 2 of them were young, mid-20s, wearing plain clothes that did not quite fit their muscular frames. The third was older, heavy-set, with a phone pressed to his ear as though arranging a tow. Her instincts fired before her conscious mind caught up. The sedan's hood was raised, but the engine was not running. No one stands near an overheating engine. The younger men were positioned to flank her if she approached. The older man's phone screen was dark. She took a step backward, hand moving toward her hip where her weapon would have been if she had not left it secured in her truck's lockbox per restaurant policy. The taser caught her in the chest before she could pivot. 50,000 volts locked her muscles into rigid agony, and she went down hard, her skull cracking against concrete. The world fractured into strobing darkness as hands grabbed her arms and legs, as zip ties cinched around her wrists, as a hood descended over her face and erased the fluorescent lights entirely. Wherever you are watching this from right now, whether it's California or Texas or somewhere across the world, imagine waking up in total darkness with no idea where you're being taken. Comment your location below, because Elena Vasquez was about to discover just how far from home she could survive. Consciousness returned in fragments. The rumble of an engine beneath her. The smell of motor oil and sweat and something chemical, probably the residue from the taser. Her hands were bound behind her back, shoulders already aching from the angle, and the hood over her head trapped each breath in humid darkness. She forced her body to remain limp, her breathing slow and even, while her mind cataloged every available detail. The vehicle was large, probably a van based on the echo of voices bouncing off metal walls. She counted at least 3 distinct speakers, all male, all speaking rapid Spanish with an accent she placed as Northern Mexican. Sinaloa, maybe, possibly Tijuana. One voice dominated the conversation, older and rougher than the others. "The DEA woman is worth $2 million if we do this right. Her office will pay. They always pay for their own." Elena's pulse spiked, but she kept her breathing steady. They thought she was DEA. They had grabbed the wrong woman, mistaken a Navy SEAL commander for a drug enforcement analyst. And now they were discussing ransom as though she were a bargaining chip, rather than a weapon they had foolishly brought into their vehicle. She tested the zip ties with the slightest pressure. Standard police grade, not military. Breakable with enough leverage or the right technique, but not here, not yet. Not until she knew where they were taking her and how many she would have to go through. The van made a left turn, and through the hood, she caught the faintest whiff of salt air. They were heading toward the water. The marina, probably, or one of the smaller docks south of the city. A boat would mean distance from shore, distance from help, distance from any advantage she might manufacture. 45 minutes. She had been unconscious approximately 45 minutes based on the stiffness in her joints and the dried blood she could feel crusted on her temple. That put them well outside the city, approaching the coast, with night fully settled around them. The older voice spoke again. Once we are in international waters, we make the call. If they refuse, we have other buyers who will pay for information she carries in her head. Elena almost smiled beneath the hood. They had no idea what information she actually carried. They had no idea who they had taken. And when the moment came, when they made whatever mistake would inevitably come, she would show them exactly what a Navy SEAL looked like when she stopped pretending to be a victim. The van slowed, gravel crunching beneath tires, and the salt air grew stronger. They had arrived somewhere near the water. The next phase was about to begin. The van doors opened, and hands dragged Elena across metal flooring, her knees scraping against a ridged surface before her feet found solid ground. Gravel shifted beneath her boots, then wooden planks, the hollow sound of a dock echoing with each forced step. She counted the paces. 14 from van to dock edge. 8 more across the dock itself. Then the world tilted as they shoved her downward onto a hard fiberglass surface that rocked with the motion of water. A boat, smaller than she had hoped, based on the way it shifted under the weight of multiple bodies climbing aboard. She counted footsteps and voices, mapping the vessel in her mind. 4 men total, including the one who had spoken in the van. The pilot made brief conversation about fuel and heading, his accent slightly different from the others. Local hire, probably. Someone who knew these waters and asked no questions about hooded passengers. The engine coughed to life, a deep rumble that vibrated through the hull, and the boat pulled away from the dock with a lurch that nearly toppled her sideways. Someone grabbed her shoulder and shoved her against what felt like a storage bench. Her bound hands crushed painfully between her back and the fiberglass wall. The hood came off without warning, and Elena blinked against the sudden wash of moonlight. They were already clear of the marina, the lights of the coast shrinking behind them as the boat carved through black water toward open ocean. She scanned the deck in quick glances, cataloging everything while keeping her expression slack and frightened. 4 men, as she had counted. The pilot stood at the wheel, a lean figure in a windbreaker who never looked back at his passengers. 2 of the younger men from the parking structure sat near the bow, one of them cleaning his fingernails with a knife while the other watched Elena with flat, predatory eyes. And standing directly in front of her, phone in hand, was the older man whose voice she had memorized in the van. He was shorter than she had imagined, maybe 5'8", with a thick neck and the kind of gut that came from years of good living and little exercise. His face was weathered, scarred along one cheek, and his eyes held the casual cruelty of someone who had ordered deaths before and slept soundly afterward. He lifted his phone, the screen casting pale light across his features, and Elena caught the time before he turned away. 11:47. They had been on the water for perhaps 20 minutes, which meant they were already several miles offshore and heading farther with every passing minute. The man spoke into his phone, his Spanish rapid but clear enough for Elena to follow. "We have the package. Crossing into international waters within the hour. Begin preparing the ransom demand for delivery tomorrow morning. The DEA will pay. They always protect their analysts." He ended the call and turned to look at Elena, his expression shifting from business to something darker. He crouched in front of her, close enough that she could smell the cigars on his breath and the expensive cologne that failed to mask his sweat. "You are very quiet for a woman who has been kidnapped," he said. "Most of them cry. Most of them beg. But you just sit there with those eyes, watching everything." Elena said nothing. She held his gaze without blinking, without trembling, letting him see exactly as much fear as she wanted him to see, which was none. The man's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "My name is Diego Reyes," he said. "You will not need to remember it for long. By tomorrow, your people will pay what we ask, and you will be released somewhere along the coast. Alive, if they cooperate. Otherwise, well, the ocean is very deep and very hungry." He stood and walked to the stern, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it against the wind. Elena watched him go, memorizing the way he moved, the slight limp in his right leg, the phone he slipped into his front left pocket. Details that might matter. Details that would definitely matter if she survived long enough to use them. The boat continued into darkness. The coast now just a faint glow on the horizon. Elena shifted her weight carefully, testing the storage bench behind her. Hollow, probably containing life jackets and emergency equipment. Possibly containing something useful if she could get her hands free. Her fingers found the buckle of her belt, hidden beneath the hem of her jacket. Standard issue, nothing remarkable to look at, but sewn into the leather backing, positioned where it would press against her spine during any pat-down, was an emergency beacon no larger than a thumbnail. She had carried it for 3 years without ever needing to activate it. 3 years of deployments and operations and moments when everything could have gone wrong, but somehow did not. Tonight, everything had gone wrong. She pressed the activation sequence by feel, 3 short pulses against the hidden switch, and felt the faintest vibration that told her the beacon was now transmitting. Somewhere on shore, a Coast Guard station would receive her signal. Somewhere, people who knew what she actually was would begin asking questions about why a Navy SEAL commander was suddenly broadcasting a distress signal from 10 miles offshore. But the beacon was only half the equation. It would take time for anyone to respond, time for assets to mobilize, time for a rescue that might arrive too late. She needed to survive until then, needed to stay on this boat and stay alive and wait for her moment. Diego returned from the stern, cigarette finished, his expression no longer amused. He spoke quietly to the 2 younger men at the bow, their voices too low for Elena to catch the words. But she caught the glances they threw in her direction, caught the way one of them drew a finger across his throat in a gesture that required no translation. Something had changed. Whatever Diego had been told on that phone call, whatever calculation he had run in his head while staring at the black water, he had reached a different conclusion than Ransom. He walked toward her slowly, his shadow falling across her face as the moon emerged from behind a cloud. "Change of plans," he said. "My superiors believe you are more trouble than you are worth. A DEA analyst knows too much, has seen too many files, could identify too many faces. The ransom is not worth the risk." Elena kept her voice steady, speaking for the first time since her capture. "You're making a mistake." Diego laughed, a short bark that held no humor. "The only mistake was yours," he said. "Being in that parking lot. Being alone. Being the wrong person in the wrong place." He gestured to his men, and they came forward with hands outstretched, grabbing Elena by the arms and hauling her to her feet. She did not struggle. Not yet. The moment had not arrived, and struggling now would only waste energy she would need for what came next. They dragged her to the edge of the boat, the black water churning below, and Diego leaned close to speak directly into her ear. "The current will carry you out," he said. "By morning, there will be nothing left to find." Elena took one final breath, filling her lungs completely, and felt the hands release her shoulders. For a single suspended moment, she hung in the air, the stars wheeling overhead, the boat already pulling away. Then the ocean swallowed her whole, and the world became cold and dark and silent. The cold hit her like a sledgehammer, driving the air from her lungs in a burst of silver bubbles that spiraled toward a surface she could no longer see. Elena tumbled through blackness, disoriented by the impact, her bound hands useless behind her back as the weight of her boots dragged her downward. She forced her mind to quiet. Panic was death. Panic was lungs that emptied too fast and muscles that burned through oxygen that could not be replaced. She had trained for this, had spent countless hours in pools and open water learning to override every instinct that screamed for her to thrash and gasp and fight against the drowning dark. Her descent slowed as the air trapped in her clothing created enough buoyancy to counter her boots. She oriented herself by the pressure in her ears, by the faint shimmer of moonlight somewhere above, and began kicking toward the surface with smooth, controlled movements that conserved what little oxygen remained in her bloodstream. She broke the surface gasping, sucking air in greedy pulls while treading water with her legs alone. The boat was already 200 meters away, its running lights shrinking into the distance, the sound of its engine fading beneath the slap of waves against her face. Diego had not even looked back. He believed the ocean would finish what he had started, and in most cases he would have been right. But Elena Vasquez was not most cases. She rolled on her back, floating to give her leg a rest while she addressed the immediate problem of her bound hands. The zip tie was tight, cutting into her wrists, positioned in a way that made conventional escape nearly impossible. But SERE training had taught her techniques that conventional prisoners never learned. She took 3 deep breaths, hyperventilating slightly to saturate her blood with oxygen, then bit down on her lip and wrenched her left thumb outward with a sharp, deliberate motion. The joint dislocated with a wet pop that sent white fire racing up her arm, but her hand was suddenly smaller, more flexible, capable of sliding through a gap that had been impassable moments before. The zip tie scraped skin from her wrist as she pulled free, but then her hands were in front of her, the useless plastic falling away into the depths, and she could finally take stock of her situation. She was alone in the Pacific Ocean, approximately 10 miles from shore based on how long the boat had traveled and how small the coastal lights appeared. The water temperature was cold, but not immediately lethal, somewhere around 62 degrees, which gave her perhaps 3 hours before hypothermia began seriously degrading her physical capabilities. The current was mild, pushing slightly southward, which meant she would need to angle her swim to compensate or risk being carried past any accessible landing point. 10 miles. In a pool, under controlled conditions, she had completed 12-mile swims during the endless months of SEAL training. In open ocean, at night, with her core temperature already dropping and her thumb hanging useless at an unnatural angle, the distance seemed to stretch toward infinity. She relocated her thumb with a quick shove that made her vision blur, then began swimming. The combat side stroke was designed for exactly this situation. One arm extended forward, pulling through the water in long, efficient strokes while the other arm recovered close to the body. Legs scissoring in a motion that maximized thrust while minimizing the energy expended. Head turning to breathe on every fourth stroke, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of debris or current or the dorsal fins that sometimes patrolled these waters at night. She fell into rhythm within the first 100 meters, her body remembering patterns drilled into muscle memory through years of brutal repetition. Stroke, 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 breathe, stroke, 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 breathe. The coastline did not seem to grow any closer, but she knew that was an illusion created by distance and darkness. Every stroke was progress. Every breath was survival. Her mind wandered as the miles accumulated, drifting through memories that seemed to belong to another person entirely. The recruiter who had laughed when she first inquired about SEAL training, asking if she understood that women were not permitted in the program. The commanding officer who had grudgingly allowed her to attempt BUD/S after the policy changed, then predicted publicly that she would ring the bell before the end of Hell Week. The instructors who had pushed her harder than any male candidate, searching for the breaking point that would prove their assumptions correct. She had not broken. She had completed the underwater noddying exercises with lungs burning and vision darkening. She had survived the pool competency tests where instructors tore her mask away and tied her oxygen hose in knots while she maintained perfect calm at the bottom of the diving well. She had emerged from Hell Week with frostbitten toes and a separated shoulder and the same quiet determination that had carried her through every obstacle since childhood. The Pacific Ocean was just another obstacle. Larger than most, colder than most, but ultimately just another test that she would pass, because the alternative was unacceptable. A cramp seized her left calf without warning, locking the muscle into a knot of agony that halted her stroke and sent her sinking slightly before she could compensate. She rolled on her back, floating while her fingers dug into the cramping tissue, working the muscle loose through sheer force while waves slapped against her face and tried to fill her mouth with salt water. The cramp released after 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. She floated for another moment, letting her heart rate settle, staring up at stars that had guided sailors home for thousands of years. Orion hung low on the horizon, his belt pointing toward the coast. The North Star burned steady above her, a fixed point in a world that had become nothing but cold water and distant lights. She resumed swimming, adjusting her stroke to favor her weakened left leg, pushing through the protest of muscles that had already given more than any reasonable person would ask. But Elena had stopped being reasonable somewhere around mile 3 of Hell Week, and she had no intention of becoming reasonable now. The coastal lights grew incrementally brighter with each passing hour. She could make out individual clusters now, the glow of harbors and hotels and highways that represented safety and warmth and the end of this endless night. 5 miles, perhaps. Maybe less. Close enough that she could almost taste the shore, close enough that giving up would be the most absurd possible choice. She thought about Diego Reyes, probably arriving at some safe house right now, probably pouring himself a drink to celebrate the successful elimination of a problem. He had no idea that the problem was still swimming, still breathing, still coming for him with a focus that the cold could not touch and the distance could not diminish. She would reach the shore. She would find him, and she would make him understand exactly how badly he had miscalculated when he threw a Navy SEAL in her natural environment and expected her to drown. The next stroke carried her forward, and the next, and the next. The emergency beacon signal arrived at Coast Guard Station, San Diego at precisely 1:17 in the morning, a blip on a screen that should have been routine, but instead sent Lieutenant Marcus Webb lurching forward in his chair with coffee sloshing over his knuckles. He set the mug down and pulled up the beacon registration, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced speed. Every emergency beacon was linked to a federal database, cataloged by owner name and affiliation and next of kin. Most activations came from fishing boats with engine trouble or pleasure craft that had wandered too far from shore. This one was different. The registration filled his screen, and Webb stopped breathing. Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez, United States Navy. Designation Naval Special Warfare. Current assignment classified. Emergency contact listed as Commander, Naval Special Warfare Group 1. He read the information twice, then a third time, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. Naval Special Warfare meant SEALs. Lieutenant Commander meant senior officer. And the beacon was transmitting from a position 10 miles offshore, moving slowly but steadily toward the coast at a speed that made no sense for any vessel. Webb grabbed his phone and dialed the Navy's emergency coordination line, a number he had used perhaps twice in his entire career. The duty officer answered on the second ring, his voice flat with the boredom of a quiet night watch. "This is Lieutenant Webb, Coast Guard Station, San Diego. I have an emergency beacon activation from one of your personnel. Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez, Naval Special Warfare." Signal originating approximately 10 miles offshore and moving toward the coast. The boredom vanished from the duty officer's voice instantly. "Say that name again." "Vasquez. Elena Vasquez." The beacon shows her in the water, no vessel registration attached. "Hold." Webb waited, listening to muffled voices on the other end of the line, urgent tones that confirmed his suspicion that this was not a routine situation. When the duty officer returned, his voice had changed entirely, carrying the sharp edge of someone whose night had just become very complicated. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez was reported missing 4 hours ago from a restaurant parking structure in downtown San Diego. Her vehicle was found with signs of struggle. "We have been treating this as a potential kidnapping." Webb pulled up the beacon telemetry on his secondary monitor, watching the small dot inch across the digital map like a determined insect crawling across a windshield. "Your commander is in the water," he said, 10 miles out, moving toward shore at approximately 1.5 knots. The line went silent for a long moment. 1.5 knots, the duty officer repeated slowly. "That is not a boat. That is not a life raft. That is someone swimming." Webb stared at the telemetry, the numbers suddenly making a terrible kind of sense. A swimmer moving at that speed, covering that distance, in water that cold at night. It should have been impossible. It should have been suicide. But the beacon kept transmitting, kept moving, kept inching toward the shore one stroke at a time. "We are scrambling a helicopter," the duty officer said. "Coast Guard assets are requested to assist with search and recovery. I am also alerting Naval Special Warfare Command directly." This situation just became priority one. Webb was already on his feet, grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair. "I will be on that helicopter," he said. "Patch me through to your command frequency once you have assets in the air." He hung up before the duty officer could respond and headed for the door at a pace that was not quite running, but close enough. The helicopter pad was a 3-minute walk from the station, and he covered it in two, his mind churning through the implications of what he had just learned. A Navy SEAL commander kidnapped from a parking structure, now swimming through the Pacific Ocean in the middle of the night. The kidnappers had clearly decided to dispose of their captive at sea, probably assuming that the cold and the distance would do their work for them. They had made a critical miscalculation. The helicopter was already spinning up when Webb reached the pad, rotors slicing through the salt air with a rhythmic thump that he felt in his chest. He climbed aboard and strapped in, grabbing a headset from the hook above his seat and pulling it over his ears. The pilot's voice crackled through the speakers. "We have coordinates locked. 10 minutes to target location. What exactly are we looking for out there?" Webb watched the coastline fall away beneath them as the helicopter banked toward open water. "A swimmer," he said. "One swimmer, approximately 7 miles out now, heading for shore." The pilot did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice carried a note of disbelief that Webb understood completely. 7 miles. In this water. At night. And she is still swimming. "She is still swimming," Webb confirmed. He pulled up the real-time telemetry on his tablet, watching the beacon inch forward with agonizing slowness. According to her file, she is a Navy SEAL. According to that beacon, she has been in the water for almost 2 hours and she has not stopped moving. The helicopter pressed forward into darkness, its searchlight cutting a pale swath across black waves that stretched to the horizon. Somewhere beneath those waves, somewhere in the vast emptiness between the aircraft and the distant shore, a woman was fighting the ocean itself and refusing to lose. Webb had served in the Coast Guard for 12 years. He had pulled drowning victims from the surf and recovered bodies from capsized boats and watched good swimmers succumb to currents that were simply too strong to overcome. He had never heard of anyone completing a 10-mile open water swim at night, in cold water, after being thrown from a moving boat. But the beacon kept moving. The signal kept transmitting. And somewhere out there, Elena Vasquez kept swimming. The Navy frequency crackled to life in his headset, multiple voices coordinating assets and sharing information with the clipped efficiency of people who trained for exactly this kind of crisis. Webb listened as helicopters were diverted, as boats were dispatched, as an entire apparatus of military power began converging on one small point of light, moving slowly through an endless ocean. They would find her. They would pull her from the water and wrap her in thermal blankets and rush her to medical facilities that would treat her for hypothermia and exhaustion. That was the plan. That was the mission. But something in Webb's gut told him that Elena Vasquez had a different plan entirely. Something in the steady, unrelenting movement of that beacon suggested a woman who was not waiting to be rescued, but rather swimming towards something specific with a focus that the cold could not diminish. The helicopter pressed on, and Webb watched the telemetry and waited to see what kind of person could turn the Pacific Ocean into a pathway instead of a grave. 5 miles from shore, Elena felt her body beginning to fail. The cold had seeped past her skin and into her muscles, turning each stroke into a negotiation between willpower and physics. Her arms moved through the water with mechanical precision, but the power behind each pull had diminished noticeably over the past hour. Her kick had become shallow, conserving energy at the cost of speed. The coastline seemed no closer than it had been an eternity ago, a cruel illusion created by darkness and exhaustion and the relentless indifference of the Pacific. She rolled on her back for 30 seconds, floating to give her burning shoulders a moment of relief. The stars wheeled overhead, unchanged and uncaring, the same stars that had watched sailors drown for thousands of years. Her breath came in ragged pulls now, each exhale visible as a faint mist that the wind scattered immediately. Core temperature dropping, probably below 96 degrees, maybe lower. The shivering had stopped 20 minutes ago, which was not a good sign. When shivering stopped, it meant the body had given up trying to generate heat through muscle contraction. It meant the cold was winning, shutting down systems one by one, preparing for an end that would come quietly if she let it. Elena did not intend to let it. She resumed her stroke, forcing her arms to extend fully, forcing her legs to kick with something approaching their normal power. The pain was a distant thing now, muffled by cold and adrenaline and the particular numbness that came from pushing a human body past every reasonable limit. She had felt this before, during the endless pool sessions of training, during the open water swims where instructors followed in boats and watched for the moment when a candidate would break. She had not broken then. She would not break now. A cargo ship materialized from the darkness at perhaps 200 meters to her right, its running lights casting long reflections across the swells. For a moment she considered signaling, waving her arms, or shouting to attract attention from whoever was standing watch on that massive deck. A rescue would mean warmth and safety and the end of this impossible swim. But rescue would also mean hospitals and debriefs and hours of delay, while Diego Reyes and his men vanished into whatever hole they had crawled from. She had heard the location during those minutes in the van, fragments of conversation that her trained mind had cataloged automatically. A safe house near the water, south of the city, where they would wait for the ransom confirmation that would never come. If she summoned help now, that intelligence would go stale. Diego would learn that his victim had survived, and he would disappear along with every other cartel operative connected to the operation. The chance to dismantle their network would evaporate like morning fog. Elena watched the cargo ship pass, its wake rocking her gently, and kept swimming toward the shore. Her mind drifted as the miles accumulated, seeking refuge from the present in memories that still carried warmth. Her first deployment, the way her teammates had tested her constantly during those early weeks until she proved herself in a firefight that left 3 enemy combatants dead and her squad without a scratch. The commanding officer who had once predicted her failure, calling her into his office to admit, with visible difficulty, that he had been wrong about her. She thought about the recruits she had trained in the years since, young men and women who arrived at selection with dreams of becoming something extraordinary. She always told them the same thing during those first brutal days. The ocean does not care who you are. The mountain does not care who you are. The enemy does not care who you are. The only thing that matters is what you do when everything inside you screams to quit. Right now, everything inside her was screaming to quit. Her shoulders burned with each stroke. Her lungs ached from hours of rhythmic breathing in cold, salt-laden air. Her legs had become distant appendages that responded to commands with increasing reluctance. Every cell in her body wanted to stop, to float, to let the current carry her wherever it wished. She kept swimming. The coastline resolved gradually from a smear of light into distinct shapes. Hotels and restaurants, and the dark masses of cliffs where the shore rose steeply from the water. She was close enough now to make out individual buildings, close enough to smell the faint organic scent of kelp and sand beneath the omnipresent salt. 3 miles, maybe less. Her stroke had deteriorated into something barely recognizable, a shuffling movement through water that seemed to thicken with every passing minute. But she was still moving, still making progress, still refusing to surrender to an ocean that had claimed far stronger swimmers than her. A sound reached her between strokes, faint at first but growing steadily. Rotors. A helicopter, its searchlight sweeping across the water in wide arcs that illuminated the swells like a wandering spotlight on a dark stage. The beam passed over her once, continued onward, then swung back as someone aboard recognized what they were seeing. The helicopter descended until it hovered perhaps 50 feet above the water, its downdraft creating a circle of chaos on the surface around her. A figure appeared in the open door, silhouetted against the cabin lights, lowering some kind of rescue harness toward the waves. Elena raised one arm and waved them off. A single, deliberate gesture that left no room for misinterpretation. She pointed toward the shore, toward the cluster of buildings that included a particular safe house where Diego Reyes was probably sleeping soundly, and resumed her stroke without waiting for a response. The helicopter hesitated, hovering uncertainly, its searchlight tracking her as she swam. She could imagine the confusion aboard, the radio calls demanding clarification, the disbelief that anyone who had been swimming for hours in cold water would refuse extraction when rescue was literally dangling in front of them. But Elena had not survived this long to let someone else finish what she had started. Diego Reyes had thrown her into the ocean expecting her to die. She intended to walk out of that ocean and show him exactly how wrong he had been. The helicopter climbed slightly, maintaining its position overhead, its searchlight now a constant companion illuminating her path toward the shore. They would follow her, she knew. They would watch and wait and be ready to intervene if she faltered. She had no intention of faltering. The shore was close now. 2 miles, maybe less. She could see the white foam of waves breaking against sand, could hear the distant rumble of surf competing with the helicopter's rotors. Every stroke brought her closer to solid ground, closer to Diego, closer to the reckoning that had been building since the moment they threw her overboard. Elena Vasquez kept swimming, and the Pacific Ocean kept trying to stop her, and the helicopter kept watching as a woman who should have been dead refused to accept that verdict. Diego Reyes poured himself a second glass of tequila and settled into the leather couch with a satisfaction that warmed him more than the alcohol. The safe house was quiet, his men scattered through the rooms in various states of rest, the boat pilot already paid and dismissed to wherever boat pilots went when their work was done. Outside, the Pacific stretched dark and endless toward a horizon that had swallowed one more problem without complaint. He checked his phone. 3:47 in the morning. By now, the current would have carried the woman miles from where they had dropped her. By sunrise, there would be nothing left to find. The ocean was reliable that way, efficient in its consumption of things that needed to disappear. The front door opened and Alejandro Vega stepped through, his presence immediately changing the energy of the room. Vega was not supposed to be here. Vega was supposed to be in Tijuana, coordinating the next shipment, insulated from operational details that could become legal liabilities. His unexpected arrival meant something had changed, and from the expression on his face, that change was not good. Diego stood, setting his glass on the table with a care that masked his sudden unease. Alejandro, I was not expecting you until next week. Vega crossed the room without responding, his eyes fixed on Diego with an intensity that made the younger man want to step backward. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Diego could smell the cigarette smoke embedded in his expensive suit, and pulled out his phone. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, turning the screen so Diego could see. Diego looked. The screen showed a transcript, some kind of intercepted communication, military frequencies judging by the formatting. His eyes scanned the text and felt ice crystallize in his stomach. Naval Special Warfare Command Priority Alert. Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez, Active Duty SEAL Officer, Emergency Beacon activated. Last known position 10 miles offshore San Diego. Asset recovery in progress. Diego read the words 3 times, hoping they would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They did not. "This is not possible," he said. The woman was DEA. Our source confirmed she was DEA, an analyst from the regional office. Vega's hand moved faster than Diego could react, the slap cracking across his face with enough force to send him stumbling against the couch. When he looked up, Vega's expression had not changed at all, still carrying that same flat intensity that was somehow worse than rage. "Your source was wrong," Vega said. "Your source gave us a Navy SEAL commander." Your source made us attack a member of the United States military's most elite special operations unit, and you threw her into the ocean. Diego's mind raced through the implications, each one worse than the last. Kidnapping a federal agent was serious, but manageable, the kind of crime that could be negotiated around with enough money and enough lawyers. Kidnapping military personnel was something else entirely. That was an act of war, an attack on the armed forces, the kind of offense that brought the full weight of American military power down on everyone connected to it. "She is dead," he said, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. "We threw her 10 miles out. No one survives that." Vega held up his phone again, scrolling to a different section of the intercept. Her beacon is still transmitting. It has been moving toward shore for the past 3 hours. Moving at the speed of a swimmer. "Diego, she's not dead. She's swimming back." The words refused to make sense. 10 miles in cold water, at night, after being thrown from a moving boat. No one could survive that. No one could swim that distance under those conditions. It was physically impossible, but the beacon was still transmitting. The military was mobilizing. And somewhere out there in the darkness, a woman he had left for dead was apparently refusing to cooperate with his assumptions. Vega pocketed his phone and turned toward the door. "I'm leaving," he said. "The helicopter will be here in 20 minutes. I suggest you and your men do the same. Scatter. Disappear. Pray that she drowns before she reaches shore, because if she survives, she can identify all of us. And the Americans will not stop hunting until they find everyone connected to this disaster." He paused at the door, looking back at Diego with something that might have been contempt or might have been pity. "You had one job: grab a DEA analyst, collect the ransom, release her somewhere remote. Simple, clean, profitable. Instead, you grab a Navy SEAL and try to murder her. Whatever happens next is on your head." The door closed behind him, and Diego stood alone in the sudden silence, his cheeks still burning from the slap, his mind churning through options that seemed to shrink with every passing second. He could run, pack a bag, grab his emergency cash, disappear into Mexico before sunrise. But Vega's network was everywhere, and running would mark him as a liability to be eliminated rather than protected. He could stay and hope she drowned, but the beacon kept transmitting and the military kept mobilizing, and hope seemed like a poor foundation for survival. Or he could prepare, board up the safe house, arm his men, wait to see if the impossible woman actually made it to shore. If she did, if she somehow survived the ocean and found her way here, he would be ready. 3 armed men against 1 exhausted swimmer, no matter how well trained, were odds he could live with. Diego pulled out his phone and began making calls. "Wake up," he told each of his men. "Get your weapons. We may have a problem coming." Outside, the helicopter carrying Alejandro Vega lifted into the night sky and banked toward the border, leaving Diego and his team alone in a safe house that suddenly felt much less safe. Somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the beach, beyond the breaking waves, a woman was still swimming. And Diego Reyes was beginning to understand, with a clarity that the tequila could not dull, that he had made the worst mistake of his life when he threw Elena Vasquez into the Pacific Ocean and expected her to die. The helicopter maintained its position overhead as Elena approached the 3-meal mark, its searchlight a constant companion that painted the swells silver and black. Marcus Webb watched through night vision binoculars, tracking the small figure that moved through the water with a rhythm that should have faltered hours ago, but somehow kept going. His radio crackled with traffic from multiple channels. Navy assets coordinating approach vectors. Coast Guard vessels adjusting their positions to provide support. And beneath all of it, a quiet disbelief that permeated every transmission, the shared understanding that they were witnessing something that should not be possible. She waved off the rescue swimmer. Webb said into his headset, still not quite believing the words as he spoke them. She pointed toward the shore and kept going, requesting guidance on how to proceed. The response came from someone senior, a voice he did not recognize, but whose authority was unmistakable. Maintain observation. Do not interfere unless she shows signs of distress. Commander Vasquez has operational authority in the field. Webb lowered the binoculars and looked at the pilot, who shrugged with the practiced indifference of someone who had seen strange things before and expected to see stranger things again. "You heard the man," the pilot said. "We watch. We wait. We let the SEAL do whatever SEALs do." The helicopter adjusted its position, following Elena's slow progress toward a coastline that was now close enough to show individual features. Cliffs and beaches and the dark shapes of buildings clustered near the water. Webb pulled up a map on his tablet, cross-referencing her trajectory with known locations. She was not heading toward the nearest beach. She was not heading toward any of the public access points where rescue vehicles could easily reach her. Instead, her path angled southward toward a stretch of private coastline dotted with expensive homes and secluded properties. "She knows where she's going," Webb said. "She has a specific destination." The pilot leaned over to look at the tablet. "What is out there?" Webb zoomed in on the map, studying the cluster of buildings that seemed to align with Elena's heading. Private residences, mostly. A few small commercial properties. Nothing that stood out as particularly significant. But Elena Vasquez had been kidnapped by someone. Those someone had taken her somewhere before throwing her into the ocean. And if she had been conscious during any part of that journey, if she had heard anything or seen anything that revealed their location, then she was not swimming toward random shore. She was swimming toward the people who had tried to kill her. Webb keyed his radio again. "Request intelligence support on properties along the southern coastline. Grid reference Charlie 7 through Charlie 9. Possible cartel, safe house in that area." Commander Vasquez appears to be heading directly toward a specific location. The response took several minutes, during which Elena covered another quarter-mile with strokes that had become visibly labored but refused to stop entirely. When an intelligence officer came back on the line, his voice carried a new urgency. "We have intercepts indicating cartel activity in that area. Specifically, a property registered to a shell company with known ties to the Vega organization. Local assets report vehicles present as of 2 hours ago. Recommend you alert tactical teams for possible engagement." Webb felt the pieces clicking together in his mind. The kidnappers had taken Elena to a safe house near the water. They had driven her to a boat and taken her offshore. And somewhere during that journey, she had gathered enough information to locate them. Now she was swimming back, not to escape, not to survive, but to find the men who had thrown her overboard and make them answer for it. He keyed his radio one more time. "All units be advised. Commander Vasquez appears to be conducting a solo approach on a suspected cartel safe house. Request tactical teams stage within 1 mile of the target location, but hold position until further orders. She has operational authority. We support, we do not interfere." The responses came back in rapid succession, acknowledgments from Navy and Coast Guard assets that were already repositioning to support an operation that no one had planned, but everyone was now scrambling to facilitate. Webb returned his attention to the water, watching Elena's progress through the binoculars. She was less than 2 miles out now, close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her movements. The way each stroke seemed to cost more than the last. Her pace had slowed considerably over the past hour, but she was still moving, still making progress, still refusing to stop. The pilot tapped his shoulder and pointed toward the horizon, where the first faint suggestion of gray was beginning to separate sky from sea. Dawn was coming. In an hour, maybe less, the sun would rise on whatever Elena Vasquez had planned for the men who had tried to kill her. Webb thought about what it took to swim 10 miles through cold water in the middle of the night. He thought about the kind of training that could prepare someone for that ordeal, the kind of mindset that could push through exhaustion and hypothermia, and the constant temptation to simply stop and let the ocean win. He thought about Diego Reyes, whoever that was, sitting in some safe house right now, probably convinced that his problem had drowned hours ago, probably pouring himself a drink, probably sleeping soundly without any idea that the woman he had thrown overboard was now less than 2 miles from his door and closing the distance with every stroke. Webb almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The helicopter continued its vigil overhead, marking time until the moment when Elena Vasquez would walk out of the Pacific Ocean and show the cartel exactly what happened when they mistook a Navy SEAL for an easy target. The radio chatter continued, tactical teams reporting their positions, intelligence officers sharing updates on the suspected safe house, everyone preparing for an engagement that might happen in minutes or might not happen at all, depending on what one exhausted swimmer decided to do when she finally reached the shore. Webb kept watching. The searchlight kept illuminating her path, and Elena kept swimming, stroke after stroke after stroke, carrying herself toward a reckoning that had been building since the moment she hit the water. 1 mile to go. Then whatever came next. Elena's knees hit sand, and she nearly wept. The shore came up beneath her without warning, the ocean floor rising suddenly after hours of emptiness, and then she was crawling through the shallows on hands and knees like some primitive thing dragging itself from the primordial depths. Waves pushed at her back, urging her forward, and she let them carry her the final few meters until her palms found dry sand and the water released its grip on her legs. She collapsed on her stomach and lay there for 30 seconds, breathing, just breathing, feeling the solid earth beneath her body for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Every muscle screamed. Every joint ached with a deep, grinding pain that spoke of damage that would take days to fully manifest. Her core temperature had dropped low enough that her thoughts moved slowly, syrup through frozen pipes, each decision requiring conscious effort. But she was alive. She was on shore, and the safe house was 200 meters to her north, a dark shape against the pre-dawn sky that she had been watching for the past mile of swimming. The helicopter had pulled back, hovering somewhere over the water where its noise would not alert anyone inside the building. Smart. Someone up there understood what she was doing, had communicated her intent to people who could coordinate support without getting in her way. She would thank them later, assuming there was a later. Elena pushed herself to her feet. Her legs wobbled, threatening to buckle, but she locked her knees and forced them to hold. She had run 20 miles on a broken ankle during Hell Week. She had completed a combat dive with a collapsed lung. This was just cold and exhaustion, temporary conditions that willpower could override long enough to finish what she had started. The safe house sat at the end of a gravel driveway, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and large windows that faced the ocean. Expensive, secluded, the kind of property that drug money bought for men who needed places to disappear. 3 vehicles were parked in front, which meant at least 3 occupants, probably more. Lights glowed behind curtained windows on the ground floor. She approached through the landscaping, using ornamental shrubs and decorative boulders for cover, moving with a silence that her frozen muscles protested but ultimately provided. A guard stood near the corner of the building, rifle slung across his chest, attention fixed on the driveway rather than the beach. He never heard her coming. Elena took him from behind, one hand clamping over his mouth while the other found the pressure point below his ear that dropped him unconscious in 3 seconds. She lowered him to the ground, stripped his belt to use as a restraint, and liberated his sidearm. A Glock 19, full magazine, 1 round chambered. Familiar weight in her hand. Familiar certainty in her mind. 17 rounds. 3 vehicles. Unknown number of hostiles. The math was not ideal, but she had worked with worse. She moved to the side door, tested the handle, found it unlocked. Sloppy. Diego's men were either confident or complacent, probably both, convinced that the ocean had solved their problem hours ago. They had no reason to expect a dead woman to come walking through their door. The door opened into a utility room that connected to the main kitchen. Elena cleared the space in 2 seconds, found it empty, and continued into the hallway beyond. Voices drifted from the front of the house, casual conversation punctuated by the clink of glasses. Someone laughed at something someone else said. 2 men sat in the living room, visible through an archway at the end of the hall. One was young, maybe 25, sprawled on a couch with a beer in his hand. The other was older, heavy-set, cleaning a pistol at a coffee table littered with ammunition and takeout containers. Neither was Diego. Elena stepped through the archway and shot the older man twice in the chest before he could raise his weapon. The younger one lunged for something on the couch cushion beside him, probably a gun, but her third round took him in the shoulder and spun him sideways. Her fourth round finished the motion, and he collapsed across the cushions without making another sound. Footsteps thundered on the floor above. Someone shouting in Spanish, demanding to know what was happening. Elena moved to the base of the stairs and waited, Glock trained on the landing, counting heartbeats until a figure appeared at the top. Not Diego. Another guard, this one smarter than the others, using the wall for cover while he tried to locate the threat below. She put a round through the drywall 6 inches from his head, heard him stumble backward, and was up the stairs before he could recover. He raised his weapon as she reached the landing, but she was faster, closing the distance and driving her elbow into his throat before he could pull the trigger. He went down choking, and she took his gun and kept moving. The hallway stretched ahead of her, doors on both sides, the sounds of panicked movement coming from the room at the far end. That would be Diego. That would be the man who had stood on the deck of a boat and watched her fall into black water and assumed the ocean would do his killing for him. She kicked the door open and found him pressed against the far wall with Alejandro Vega, both men armed, both men staring at her like she was a ghost risen from the depths to claim their souls. Vega fired first, his shot going wide as Elena dropped into a crouch. Her return fire caught him center mass, 2 rounds that punched through his expensive suit and dropped him where he stood. His gun clattered across the hardwood floor and came to rest against the baseboard. Diego remained frozen, his pistol half raised, his eyes locked on the woman who stood dripping seawater onto his floor with a Glock pointed at his face. "You," he whispered. "You should be dead." Elena's finger rested on the trigger, steady despite the cold that still gripped her bones. "You threw me 10 miles from shore," she said in perfect Spanish. "It took me 4 hours to swim back, and now I am here." Diego's gun trembled in his hand. She could see him calculating, weighing odds, trying to decide if he could fire before she did. The answer was obvious to both of them. "Drop the weapon," Elena said, "or I will finish what you started in that parking garage." The gun clattered to the floor. Diego's hands rose slowly above his head, palms out, the universal gesture of surrender from a man who had run out of options. Elena kicked his weapon across the room and allowed herself one small moment of satisfaction before the exhaustion crashed back over her like a wave. She had swum 10 miles through the Pacific Ocean in the middle of the night. She had walked out of the water and cleared a cartel safe house by herself. And now Diego Reyes was going to answer for every mistake he had made since the moment he threw a Navy SEAL into the sea. Diego Reyes had imagined many ways his life might end. A bullet from a rival cartel, a prison cell in some American supermax facility, perhaps even old age, if he was lucky enough to survive long enough to retire to somewhere warm and quiet with his money and his memories. He had never imagined dying at the hands of a woman who had crawled out of the Pacific Ocean after he threw her into it. Elena stood 3 meters away, the Glock steady in her grip despite the visible tremors running through her body. Water still dripped from her clothes, pooling on the hardwood floor around her boots. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of severe cold exposure, and her lips were tinged with blue. She looked like death itself, risen from the waves to collect a debt. Behind her, Vega lay motionless in an expanding pool of blood. The man who had built an empire, who had ordered dozens of deaths, who had terrified Diego with a single slap just hours ago, was now nothing more than a body cooling on expensive flooring. Diego kept his hands raised, his mind racing through options that kept collapsing into dead ends. The guards downstairs were silent, which meant they were dead or unconscious. No backup was coming. Vega's helicopter had left hours ago, and the pilot would not return until morning. He was alone with a Navy SEAL who had every reason to kill him and apparently every capability to do so. "You have made your point," he said, keeping his voice steady through sheer force of will. "You survived. You won. But killing me gains you nothing. I have information. Names, routes, account numbers. Things the American government would pay dearly to know. Elena's expression did not change. The Glock did not waver. "I am not here to negotiate," she said. "I am here because you threw me off a boat and left me to drown. The information is a bonus." She gestured with the weapon toward the floor. "On your knees. Hands behind your head. Interlace your fingers." Diego complied, lowering himself slowly, feeling the cold hardwood press against his kneecaps. The position was humiliating, designed to strip away any remaining dignity, and he understood with sudden clarity that this woman had done this before. Many times, to men far more dangerous than him. She approached in a controlled arc, keeping distance between them, never crossing into the range where he might attempt something desperate. When she reached Vega's body, she crouched briefly without taking her eyes off Diego and retrieved the phone from his jacket pocket. He watched her thumb through the device, her expression shifting slightly as she absorbed whatever information the screen displayed. Contact. Messages. Perhaps the shipping schedules and payment records that Vega guarded so carefully. The entire architecture of their operation, now in the hands of someone who would ensure it reached exactly the wrong people. "This phone," Elena said quietly. "This is worth more than your life. Every name, every transaction, every official on your payroll. Your organization is finished." Diego felt something collapse inside him, some final hope that he might survive this night with anything intact. Even if she let him live, even if he somehow escaped prosecution, the exposure of Vega's network would make him a liability. His own people would kill him before he could testify against them. The woman seemed to read his thoughts. "You are wondering if I will kill you," she said. "The answer is no. Death is too quick. You're going to spend the rest of your life in a cell, thinking about this night, thinking about the woman you threw into the ocean, thinking about how badly you miscalculated." She pulled a zip tie from the pocket of the dead guard she had passed in the hallway, the same kind of restraint they had used on her hours ago. The symmetry was not lost on either of them. "Hands behind your back." Diego complied, feeling the plastic cinch tight around his wrists, feeling the bite of the tie against the same skin that had bound her in the van. She checked the restraint, tested its security, then stepped back and lowered the Glock for the first time since entering the room. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence filled with the distant sound of helicopters approaching, with the first gray light of dawn creeping through the windows, with the weight of everything that had happened since Diego made the worst decision of his life in a parking garage. "I have a question," Elena said finally. Her voice had lost some of its hard edge, exhaustion creeping through now that the immediate threat was neutralized. "Who told you I was DEA?" Diego looked up at her, confusion cutting through his fear. "Our source. Someone inside the Joint Task Force. They identified you at a briefing, said you were an analyst tracking our shipping routes." Elena absorbed this information with a slight nod. "Your source made a mistake," she said. "I was at that briefing as a tactical advisor, not an analyst. Someone saw a woman in civilian clothes and assumed the wrong things." Diego almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A case of mistaken identity. A source who could not tell the difference between a desk worker and a special operations commander. Such a small error, and it had cost him everything. The helicopters were louder now, close enough that their rotors shook the windows. Elena walked to the door and looked back at him one final time. "When they ask you what happened tonight," she said, "tell them the truth. Tell them you threw a Navy SEAL into the ocean and she swam back. Tell them she walked into your safe house alone and took down your entire operation. Tell them exactly what happens when you underestimate the wrong person." She disappeared through the doorway, and Diego heard her footsteps descending the stairs, moving toward the front of the house where the sound of vehicles was now joining the helicopters. Doors opening, voices shouting commands, the organized chaos of a tactical response team securing a location. He knelt alone in the room where his empire had ended, surrounded by blood and silence, and the growing light of a dawn he had never expected to see. The woman had swum 10 miles through the Pacific Ocean. She had walked out of the water like something from a nightmare. And she had dismantled everything he had built with 17 rounds and a will that the ocean itself could not break. Diego Reyes closed his eyes and waited for the men who would take him away, knowing that he would spend the rest of his life remembering this night and the woman who refused to drown. Marcus Webb was the first through the door. He had argued with his superiors for 10 minutes, insisting that Coast Guard personnel should be part of the initial entry team given their role in tracking the beacon. They had relented only when the Navy tactical commander pointed out that the shooting had stopped and the primary threat appeared to be neutralized. By the time Webb crossed the threshold with his sidearm drawn, the safe house had gone quiet. The living room looked like a war zone. 2 bodies lay where they had fallen, blood pooling on tile and soaking into upholstery. Shell casings glittered on the floor, catching the dawn light that streamed through shattered windows. The smell of cordite hung thick in the air, mixing with the copper scent of fresh death. Webb cleared the room by instinct, checking corners and doorways, before a voice from the kitchen stopped him. "In here, Lieutenant." He followed the sound and found Elena Vasquez sitting on a wooden chair near the back door, a thermal blanket draped over her shoulders by someone who had arrived moments before him. She held a phone in one hand, scrolling through its contents with the focused attention of someone cataloging evidence. Her other hand rested on the Glock she had liberated from the first guard, finger outside the trigger guard but clearly unwilling to relinquish the weapon entirely. She looked up as Webb entered, and he found himself momentarily unable to speak. He had watched her beacon cross 10 miles of ocean. He had tracked her approach to the shore. He had listened to the radio chatter as she waved off rescue and continued toward a target that no one else knew existed. But seeing her now, in person, still dripping seawater onto the kitchen floor with the bodies of cartel operatives cooling in the next room, was something else entirely. "Commander Vasquez," he managed finally. "Lieutenant Marcus Webb, Coast Guard. I was on the helicopter." She nodded, a slight movement that acknowledged his presence without wasting energy on formalities. "You tracked my beacon," she said. "That was good work." The response coordination was professional. Webb felt an absurd flush of pride at the compliment, immediately followed by embarrassment at his own reaction. This woman had just swum 10 miles and cleared a cartel safe house single-handed, and he was pleased that she approved of his radio work. "The tactical team is securing the upstairs," he said. "They found one subject alive and restrained. Diego Reyes, based on the identification in his wallet." "Is he the one who took you?" Elena's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "He is the one who threw me off the boat," she said. "The one who decided I was too much trouble to ransom. His superior is upstairs as well, but he will not be answering questions." She held up the phone she had been examining. "This belonged to Alejandro Vega. It contains their entire network, shipping schedules, payment records, names of officials on their payroll. Your intelligence people will be busy for months." Webb accepted the phone carefully, understanding that he was holding something that would reshape the landscape of cartel operations along the entire coast. He slipped it into an evidence bag from his vest pocket and sealed it with hands that were not quite steady. "Medical team is outside," he said. "They need to check you for hypothermia. Your core temperature is probably dangerously low." Elena smiled, a brief expression that carried more exhaustion than humor. "I am aware of my core temperature, Lieutenant. I have been aware of it for the past 4 hours. The medical team can wait until I have briefed the tactical commander on what I observed during my captivity." She stood, the thermal blanket slipping from her shoulders, and Webb saw the full extent of what the ocean had done to her. Her skin was pale to the point of translucence, mottled with patches of red where cold had damaged capillaries. Her hands trembled visibly, fine motor control compromised by hours of temperature loss. She moved with the careful precision of someone who knew their body was operating on reserves that would not last much longer. And yet she was standing. She was walking. She was preparing to deliver an operational briefing as though the swim and the assault had been routine exercises rather than feats that would become legend. Webb followed her toward the front of the house, where the tactical commander was coordinating the scene. Navy SEALs moved through the rooms in pairs, clearing spaces that Elena had already cleared, stepping around bodies that Elena had already created. They paused when she appeared, and Webb watched something pass through the team, a recognition that needed no words. One of them snapped to attention. Then another. Within seconds, every operator in the room was standing at attention, facing a woman who outranked most of them and had just demonstrated why. The tactical commander approached, a weathered chief petty officer whose expression suggested he had seen many things, but nothing quite like this. "Commander Vasquez," he said. "Chief Morrison, SEAL Team 5. We were scrambled to support your extraction, but it appears you handled the extraction yourself." Elena met his gaze with steady eyes. "They made a mistake," she said simply. "They thought I was someone else. They thought the ocean would finish what they started. They were wrong on both counts." She reached into her pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, damp but legible, covered in handwritten notes. "During my captivity, I gathered intelligence on their operation. Vehicle descriptions, license plates, fragments of conversation about other properties and personnel. This needs to reach naval intelligence immediately." Morrison accepted the paper with something approaching reverence. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "what you did tonight, the swim, the assault. I have been doing this for 20 years, and I have never seen anything like it." Elena's expression softened slightly. "You would have done the same, Chief. Any of us would have. The only difference is that tonight, it was my turn." She turned toward the door, where the medical team was waiting with stretchers and thermal equipment, and the urgent need to address what the Pacific Ocean had done to her body. Webb watched her go. This woman who had refused to drown, who had refused rescue, who had walked out of the sea and dismantled a cartel operation with nothing but a stolen pistol and a will that the cold could not touch. He had been in the Coast Guard for 12 years. He had seen courage, and he had seen luck, and he had seen the ocean claim people who deserved better. But he had never seen anyone like Elena Vasquez, and he suspected he never would again. The sun broke fully over the horizon as they loaded her into the ambulance, painting the ocean gold and orange, transforming the waters that had tried to kill her into something beautiful and indifferent and eternal. The debrief lasted 6 hours. Elena sat in a conference room at Naval Base Coronado, wrapped in a fresh uniform that someone had retrieved from her quarters, her hands curled around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across the table, a rotating cast of intelligence officers and agency representatives asked questions, took notes, and tried to piece together the full scope of what had happened between the parking garage and the safe house. She answered everything. The parking structure ambush, the van ride with zip-tied hands and a hood over her head, the boat, the conversation, Diego's decision to throw her overboard rather than pursue the ransom, the swim, the assault, the phone that now sat in an evidence locker, its contents being extracted and analyzed by specialists who would spend weeks mapping the network it revealed. By the time the final questioner finished, the sun had crossed the sky and was beginning its descent toward the Pacific. Elena's core temperature had stabilized hours ago, but the exhaustion remained, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of coffee could touch. A Navy captain she did not recognize entered the room as the intelligence team filed out. He carried a tablet and wore an expression that suggested he was delivering news of significance. "Commander Vasquez," he said, taking a seat across from her. "I am Captain Reynolds, Naval Intelligence. I wanted to brief you personally on what we have found." Elena straightened slightly, forcing her tired mind to focus. "The phone you recovered from Alejandro Vega contained 3 years of operational records," Reynolds continued. "Payment schedules, shipping manifests, communication logs. We have identified 47 individuals involved in the network, including 12 American officials who were receiving regular payments to facilitate cartel operations." He paused, scrolling through something on his tablet. "But that is not the most significant discovery. Vega maintained detailed records of his intelligence sources, including the person who provided your identification to Diego Reyes." Elena felt something sharpen in her chest. "Who?" Reynolds turned the tablet to face her. On the screen was a photograph she recognized, a face she had seen at Joint Task Force briefings, a man who had sat across conference tables while she delivered tactical assessments. "Gerald Patterson," Reynolds said, "senior analyst with the DEA regional office." He has been feeding information to the Vega organization for approximately 18 months. When he saw you at the task force briefing 3 weeks ago, he identified you as a DEA analyst to his cartel contacts. He did not know you were naval special warfare. Elena stared at the photograph, processing the implications. Patterson had seen a woman in civilian clothes, had made assumptions based on appearance, and had sold those assumptions to people who acted on them without verification. A chain of errors that had nearly cost her life, all originating from one man's carelessness and corruption. We arrested him 2 hours ago, Reynolds continued. He is currently in federal custody and facing charges that will keep him in prison for the rest of his natural life. His cooperation in identifying other compromised officials may reduce his sentence, but not by much. Elena nodded slowly, feeling something settle in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but something close to it. The man who had set everything in motion would face justice alongside the man who had carried out the kidnapping. "There is one more thing," Reynolds said. He set the tablet down and folded his hands on the table. "The intelligence you provided, both from the phone and from your observations during captivity, has enabled us to execute coordinated raids across 3 states. As of 1 hour ago, we have seized 3 cartel vessels, arrested 31 additional suspects, and disrupted shipping operations worth an estimated $400 million annually." He paused, letting the numbers sink in. "What you did last night, Commander, swimming 10 miles through the ocean and then conducting a solo assault on an armed position, that alone would be remarkable. But the intelligence value of your actions has dealt the most significant blow to cartel maritime operations in the past decade. You did not just survive. You dismantled an empire." Elena looked down at her cold coffee, at the hands that had pulled her through 10 miles of dark water, at the uniform that represented everything she had sacrificed to earn. "I did what anyone would have done," she said quietly. Reynolds shook his head. "No, Commander. You did what almost no one could have done. And the people who tried to kill you are going to spend the rest of their lives knowing that." He stood, gathering his tablet. "Medical has cleared you for rest, but they want you back for a follow-up examination tomorrow. Your commanding officer has authorized 72 hours of leave once you complete that examination. I suggest you use it." He paused at the door. "One more thing. Diego Reyes has been talking since we took him into custody. He cannot stop talking about you. He told his interrogators that he watched you fall into the ocean and assumed you would drown within minutes. He said he never looked back." Reynolds smiled slightly. "He also said that when you walked into that bedroom, dripping seawater with a gun in your hand, he thought you were a ghost. He thought the ocean had sent you back to punish him for his sins." Elena met his gaze. "The ocean did not send me," she said. "I sent myself." Reynolds nodded and left her alone in the conference room with her cold coffee and the fading light of a California sunset. She sat there for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across the table, feeling the weight of the past 24 hours settle into her bones. She had been kidnapped, thrown into the Pacific, left for dead by men who assumed the ocean would do their killing for them. And she had proven them wrong in every possible way. Tomorrow there would be more debriefs, more questions, more paperwork documenting what had happened and why. Eventually there would be commendations and ceremonies and all the official recognition that the military bestowed on those who exceeded expectations. But tonight, Elena just wanted to sleep. She wanted to close her eyes and let her body recover from the impossible thing it had done. She wanted to dream of something other than cold water and dark skies and the endless rhythm of strokes that had carried her home. She finished the cold coffee in one long swallow, stood on legs that still ached with remembered exhaustion, and walked out of the conference room toward whatever came next. 6 months later, Elena stood at the edge of the pool and watched the new candidates struggle. They were in the middle of drown-proofing, hands bound behind their backs, feet tied together, bobbing the deep end while instructors circled like sharks waiting for the first sign of panic. Some of the candidates moved with confidence, having mastered the technique of sinking to the bottom, pushing off, and surfacing for a breath before repeating the cycle. Others thrashed and gasped, their bodies fighting against restraints that would not give no matter how hard they pulled. 3 of the candidates were women. Elena watched them with particular attention, noting how they managed their breathing, how they controlled the fear that was every human being's natural response to simulated drowning. One of them caught her eye, a young petty officer with a calm expression that never wavered even when her head dipped below the surface for the fourth time in a minute. That one would make it. Elena could see it in the stillness behind her eyes, the absolute refusal to let panic take control. The others might make it too, or they might ring the bell and walk away from a dream that had proven too demanding. Either outcome was acceptable. What mattered was that they had been given the chance to try. The senior instructor approached, clipboard in hand, and nodded toward the pool. "Commander Vasquez, thank you for coming. The candidates have been told they would receive a guest speaker today, but they do not know who." Elena smiled slightly. "Good. I prefer it that way." She waited until the drown-proofing exercise concluded and the candidates hauled themselves onto the pool deck, shivering and exhausted but alive. They lined up in formation, water dripping from their bodies, eyes fixed forward with the 1,000-yard stare of people who had been pushed past comfortable limits and were wondering how much further they would have to go. The instructor called them to attention. "You have a guest speaker," he announced. "Commander Elena Vasquez, Naval Special Warfare." Some of you may have heard her name. For those who have not, I suggest you listen carefully. Elena stepped forward, studying the faces before her. Young, determined, terrified in ways they were trying desperately to hide. She remembered standing in their place, remembered the instructors who had tried to break her, remembered the voices that had told her she did not belong in this place or this program. 6 months ago, she began, "I was kidnapped from a parking garage in San Diego. The men who took me believed I was someone else, someone less dangerous than a naval special warfare officer. They drove me to a boat, took me 10 miles offshore, and threw me into the Pacific Ocean in the middle of the night." She paused, letting the words settle over the candidates like cold water. They assumed I would drown. They assumed the ocean would do their killing for them. They assumed wrong. The young petty officer she had noticed earlier was staring at her with an intensity that bordered on hunger. The others wore similar expressions, fatigue temporarily forgotten in the face of a story they had only heard rumors about. "I swam 10 miles back to shore," Elena continued. "When I reached the beach, I did not call for help. I did not wait for rescue. I walked into the safe house where my kidnappers were hiding, and I dismantled their operation with a stolen pistol and the training that you were just beginning to receive." She stepped closer to the formation, close enough to see the individual drops of water still clinging to their skin. "The men who threw me overboard made a mistake that cost them everything. They looked at me and saw a victim. They saw someone who would sink beneath the waves and disappear. They did not see a Navy SEAL. They did not see someone who had spent years learning to survive exactly the kind of situation they had created." Elena met the eyes of each candidate in turn, holding their gaze for a moment before moving to the next. "Some of you will not complete this program. That is not a failure. This life is not for everyone, and there is no shame in discovering that it is not for you. But for those of you who stay, for those of you who push through the cold and the exhaustion and the voice in your head that tells you to quit, I want you to remember something." She paused, thinking of the endless hours in Blackwater, the cramps that had threatened to stop her, the moment when the helicopter had offered rescue and she had waved it away. The ocean does not care who you are. The enemy does not care who you are. The only thing that matters is what you do when everything inside you screams to stop. You keep going. You keep fighting. You refuse to let anything, not the cold, not the distance, not the people who underestimate you, determine whether you live or die. She stepped back, her voice softening slightly. "I'm not special. I am not superhuman. I am someone who refused to quit when quitting would have been the easier choice. That is all any of us can do. That is all any of us needs to do." The instructor dismissed the formation, and the candidates scattered toward the barracks for their brief rest period before the next evolution. But the young petty officer lingered, approaching Elena with the hesitant determination of someone who had a question they needed to ask. "Commander," she said, "during the swim, 10 miles in cold water at night, was there ever a moment when you thought you would not make it?" Elena considered the question, remembering the cramps, the hypothermia, the moment when the shore had seemed impossibly far and her body had begged her to stop. Every stroke, she said honestly, every single stroke, I thought about stopping. The difference is that I did not stop. I kept swimming until there was nothing left to swim through. The young woman nodded slowly, something shifting behind her eyes. Thank you, Commander. She jogged toward the barracks, and Elena watched her go, thinking about all the miles that Candidate had yet to swim, all the trials she had yet to face, all the moments when she would have to choose between surrender and survival. If you have made it this far in this story, think about your own ocean. Think about the thing in your life that seems impossible, the distance that feels too far, the challenge that makes you want to quit before you even begin. Now ask yourself what happens if you keep swimming. What happens if you refuse to stop? Drop a comment and tell me about the ocean you are facing, because everyone has one. And everyone has the choice to keep going or to let the waves win. Elena turned away from the pool and walked toward the exit, the California sun warm on her face, the Pacific glittering in the distance like a promise and a threat and an old adversary that had tested her once and found her unbreakable. Diego Reyes was serving a 45-year sentence in a federal supermax facility. Gerald Patterson had pleaded guilty to espionage charges and would die in prison. The Vega organization had collapsed entirely, its shipping routes disrupted, its leadership dead or incarcerated, its legacy reduced to case files and cautionary tales. And Elena Vasquez, the woman they had thrown into the ocean expecting her to drown, was still standing. She was still swimming. She always would be.